Hello and welcome to Charity Champions, the podcast where we celebrate the leaders making a real difference across the charity and not-for-profit sector. I'm your host, Emily Formby from Charity Recruit. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Brian Willmore. Brian has spent more than 3 decades leading change across charities, housing, health and local government. He's helped organisations navigate transformation, advised government on national policy, sits on major boards and has built a reputation for helping organisations move from good to great. Alongside his executive career, Brian is a non-exec director at Riverside Housing Group. He contributes as a columnist to Inside Housing and he advises the Ministry of Defence on improving support for veterans returning from active service. But what really struck me was when I first met Brian, it wasn't just his impressive CV, it was his whole story. Having experienced homelessness as a teenager, Brian has dedicated his career to improving the lives of people facing disadvantage. And that lived experience still shapes the way he leads today. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you onto Charity Champions, Brian.
Morning, thanks for having me.
I'd love to start at the beginning. Obviously, we've had a conversation and you've given me the overview of your background, but I know our listeners will be absolutely fascinated. If we could start at the beginning and share, where your career really began and your own experiences of homelessness as a young person. Tell us about that journey.
Sure. So I was trundling along quite happily at stage school, doing what you do as a teenager. And then I ended up homeless as a teenager, living on the streets when I was 16. And really, at the time, obviously, it was a very difficult, traumatic experience, not least because you've got no real understanding or experience of the world at that age. All you've ever known is your world, which is your family and your home and school or whatever. So whilst that was a really difficult experience, I suppose in hindsight now, 31 years later, I suppose really it's been the thing that I've managed to turn from the ultimate negative into the ultimate positive. And as that bedrock of my career, really. So through that process, when I was on the streets and homeless and stuff, I kind of met various people along the way who helped me, and a lot of those people were people who worked in social care. And really that's what sparked something in me about kind of using that experience to give something back. I don't think I recognised it in those terms at that age, but I guess probably since I've got now of lived experience, I think I probably felt something about it, that I could do something with it. So I very quickly started to kind of form a plan. And I guess in a way I've honed some of the skills then at that age with that experience that have kind of seen me through my career, really, particularly as an interim for the last 15 years. The skills around moving at pace, around kind of compassionate decision making, all of those things I think were in their early form, sort of fledgling sort of skill set there, really. So, I mean, I'm often asked this question, and I think there's some total for me around that experience when I was young, which obviously it was very traumatic at the time. And for many years afterwards, there was a lot of trauma. But I think, would I choose it? No. Would I change it? No. Because really it's been the birth of everything I've got in my life. So ultimately, I'm grateful that I've managed to gain so much from it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet. So I know when we'd spoken, you'd mentioned you were one of the youngest people, I think, to sit on a board of trustees. Talk me through how the journey went from, that first role within the sector through to where you are now.
Sure. So when I was 18, one of those people that I'd met that kind of inspired me and started to help me was somebody who was involved in a youth counselling organisation. And I went through a lot of counselling, obviously, and for many years afterwards, actually, but at that time. And I kind of thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to give something back. So I thought, well, I want to get involved if I can in some way. And really, I sort of sat in a bit of a young person's advisory role, I guess you might call it now. This is a very long 30 years ago. I don't think things were formed quite the way they are. We didn't really have that understanding of young people's involvement in the same finessed, structured way that we do now in terms of young being involved in running, designing, delivering, assuring services. But I was kind of involved in that. And then I got asked to sit on the board of trustees for the management committee. And I thought, well, go for it, It was around this time that I'd seen a job as an apprentice youth and community worker, a social work role. And I applied for it and I got it, a traineeship and apprenticeship. So I thought, well, this will really help. And all of a sudden, and then at that time, I got my little council flat as well when I was 18. So all of a sudden, I'd gone from being homeless to kind of having a purpose, a job, an apprenticeship, a place of my own, and a real support network around. Because actually what those experiences gave me with that apprenticeship on that management committee was quite a network of support really around me, of adults who, you know, were really keen to help me and support me. And many of those people now I'm still regularly in contact with, even 30 odd years later.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and actually some of the professionals who helped me then I'm very much in touch with now, who are still working in the sector. Well, most of them retired now, but, you know, working. So there's a really nice sort of thing there for me around kind of, you know, it's nice to be in touch with those people who supported me all those years ago, helped me through an incredibly difficult phase. But I think one of the things that I discovered being homeless was that I'd lacked a lot of, I had a lot of confidence and a lot of self-esteem because I was at drama school, but I think I lacked an understanding of what skills I had. I was quite a lonely child. I was an only child for the first 8 years of my life. I have siblings, and then I think I really didn't. I think I struggled understanding who I was when I was young. And once I was homeless, I think I really developed some skills around realizing that I'm very good at making friends and working with people and social skills, if you will. And I realized a lot more about me than I'd ever realized in the life I was living before when I was living at home. So again, all positive out of a negative, I guess. And I suppose, just to sort of caveat this, you know, it's easy for me to sit here now 31 years later and say this in these very positive terms. It wasn't like that at that time, obviously. It was traumatic, but I guess, you know, it speaks perhaps to my personality that I view things as positives rather than negatives. That's very much, I would say, a characteristic that I have as a system. But really going back to the question you asked, so through that sort of support network around me, through sort of getting my own place, which was a really big thing, and, you know, youth homelessness now, it wouldn't be like that. I'm sure that there is no support. You wouldn't be able to get a council flat now or a social housing property at 18. I think it would be incredibly challenging to get it in that short space of time. And, you know, that I was very fortunate then, you know, in the 90s that network and that support and that safety net did exist in a much more available way, I guess, than it is now. But all of a sudden, I felt like I had all the building blocks for life, really. And that's when the journey started. And as I said, I started to learn that there were certain things I was good at that I'd never realised before, you know, skills that perhaps I wouldn't have used when I was at drama school or previously at a traditional school. So I started to kind of throw myself into it and found I kind of, you know, I was pushing an open door, I guess, really. So, yeah, that's where it began for me, really, all those years ago.
That's brilliant. And I know you'd mentioned earlier in your career that you felt you'd had to tone down your personality because leadership looked quite different back then. Do you think that we've become better leaders in the last 20 to 30 years, or is it simply that we're better at talking about leadership? What's your experience there?
I think that's a real a nuanced question with I'm going to give a nuanced answer, I guess. To that. So, I mean, I've got a big personality and I don't look or behave or appear like a lot of leaders, certainly not when I started in my career. I was in management at 22, you know, that's nearly 30 years ago now. You know, showing my age there. But so I think I did definitely dumb down my personality. Now, as I've got older, when I was in my sort of late 30s, I got a diagnosis of ADHD and autism. So all of a sudden, all those behaviours make sense to me now, and I've got in which to understand why I'm a little bit different to people around me. Now, you know, 25, 30 years ago, that wasn't the way of the world. And certainly, I think in leadership, you know, even though I was a sort of low-level manager then, I think I definitely perhaps fell short of some of those obstacles without understanding them and sort of leadership behaviours. It's only really in the last 5 or 6 years that I felt really comfortable bringing 100% of who I am to work, and actually starting to trade on that a bit and realizing that those experiences and those things about me are actually really useful engagement tools as a leader. So actually, you know, more and more people in the workplace now have challenges that they influence and affect and impact their work. And, you know, for example, we've got a lot more cognizance of the menopause and the impact that has on employees now. You know, with understanding of perhaps people's living situation at home and what that looks like, their caring responsibilities and how that impacts work, whether they're neurodivergent or not, or indeed if they just have very different learning styles. You know, we're a lot more cognizant of it, but I still, if I'm being really honest, I've still faced quite a degree of prejudice, I think, even in the last couple of years. Certainly in 1 or 2 organisations I've worked in, there's a certain type of leader that I work for, and, you know, that they look and behave a very certain way, and they're always the type of person that never gets me, and they're always the person that I think struggles with a personality like mine, a personality who can instantly connect with people and very quickly get support and respect and can get and be liked in the workplace. And I think for some leaders that I've worked for, I mean, I can only assume this, I don't know for sure, but I think they feel threatened by that, or perhaps they felt that I'm not behaving in the way that one should. And for that reason, it's been quite challenging, you know, for me in some senses. That's the way of the world, of course. You know, not everybody likes everybody, and that's absolutely fine. I'm not bothered about that. You know, lots of people don't like me, and that's absolutely fine. But yeah, I think what's important is the conversations there, and that's how it all starts, isn't it? And it's a long journey we go on, isn't it? And I guess in 20-30 years time, when we've mastered all of this stuff, there'll be a whole new set of things that come radar that will be new for us again. So I guess it's an ever decreasing circle, really, in that sense. But yeah, I think we're certainly getting there in some senses.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, we talked about compassionate decision making as part of your leadership journey. And I suppose some of the struggles and challenges that you've faced have helped you to become that compassionate decision maker. But how do you make difficult decisions, when you have to? What's your style there?
So I think for me, I'm taking this in the round, really. So difficult decisions can be around an employee, it could be around safeguarding, it could be a budgetary issue, redundancy, but sort of taking it in its whole sort of as a question. I think for me that there's two sort of tracks that I run on when I'm making a decision. And one is kind of perhaps around what you might term a professional sort of consideration. So that's what's the risk to the business, what's the risk to the reputation, what's the risk to the budget, to the health and safety, to the well-being of an employee. So all the things that could unpick the business and leave us vulnerable to other issues. So that's one guiding principle. But then the one that sometimes I felt in the past for some of my peers and leaders I've worked for that's been missing is the personal angle. And this really, I think, is the bit that where the compassionate decision making comes in. And so a couple of things around that for me then. I think you have to be, dispassionate in your judgment, but compassionate in your approach. So that's the first thing. So, taking away all the views and values and judges around why somebody may have done something or what may have led to this, but actually just thinking about it in a very cold, sort of factual, contextual way. For example, if we're dealing with employee behaviour at work, an employee makes an error that leads to a serious situation. I mean, I think it's not really very often you meet employees who want to get sacked, is it? So with that in mind, I always think, well, there's got to be a reason for this. So firstly, I think understanding that reason. Now, sometimes mistakes are so grave that they have to be dealt with through a formal process, and that's a fact of life. But by and large, I've found that people have often taken steps that at that point in time making those decisions, they thought they were the right thing to do. And with that context, it's sometimes easier to resolve a situation. It's not always the way, of course, as I say, but I've often found that to be a good starting point. Secondly, I think there's something around the wider thing here for people. So what was going on within the organisation, situations that leave organisations at risk are never usually the action of one individual. There's normally a chain of events that have gone before that you may or may not be aware of. And I think, again, that secondary context there is really, really key to determining the outcome and the approach there. And lastly, I guess it's just about remembering that within all of that, there is a person who has feelings and may be really devastated and upset and embarrassed and ashamed of what they've done, or, may have done something with, which we'll be talking about a service user here or a person that we support on a professional client basis. There's always something going on for them that we have to be mindful of. No, none of those things take away from what the outcome may have been. But I think that it's, like I said, in summary, it's that thing about dispassionate judgment, compassionate approach. And it's never really done me any harm in life. That I've always found that 9 times out of 10, I've got a good resolution. But crucially, I think there's still been a degree of respect there between the business and the person affected, and the person affected and the person dealing with it, i.e. me. And I think in some senses, when you're dealing with a big risk issue, that's the best you can hope for, really, that it's an adult, mature, emotional, free conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a very pragmatic approach, and one that's, like you said, an ideal solution for the organisation and the individuals involved. You'd mentioned that someone had described you as a person who makes bad good and good brilliant, and I thought that was such a great description. What is it about sort of transformation that excites you? I know you've worked across sort of housing, mental health, charities, local government, NHS, all very, very different. Talk me through what it is about transformation that excites you.
So I think, as I'd alluded to earlier, being a person who is neurodivergent, there's something around kind of having lots of plates spinning and lots of energy and being able to problem solve that really sparked me. I really enjoy problem solving conundrums on quite complex scales and with lots of varied factors. I need quite a lot of stress and quite a lot of work and quite a lot of challenge to be at my optimum performance level. I'm not good in environments where I'm treading water, I'm not doing much. I'm happiest when I'm, working 16-hour days. Not that anyone ever asked me to do that. I would have as a choice. But I'm very happy when I'm doing that. And I've got a million different projects and issues and challenges and risks and things, transformation stuff on the go. So it speaks to my personality. But I suppose more than that, there's some of the roles I've had in the past when I was a face-to-face field worker, if you will, quite often when you're dealing with clients who've got complex lives and lots of issues going on, there isn't really ever an end to it. And, that's not a criticism, it's an observation. But with there being an end to it, sometimes as a professional, it's hard to get that sense of reward. Like, when you go home at night, you think, it sounds a bit trite, but for me, there's something really comforting in the fact that I go to bed at night thinking I did try and make things a bit better for someone today. That's one of my guiding principles, that I really do want to try and make the world a better place in the tiny, tiny way that I can. And when you're working sometimes with clients with lots of challenges and in services and on the front line, that sense of kind of resolution, if you will, isn't there for a professional, I don't think, least of all nowadays, because there's so many challenges for people out there and they're so complex and multi-layered. And whereas in a transformation sort of role or leadership role, quite often there can be a resolution and you can see the fruits of your labour and you do get to go and think, wow, I can see what I did today, earn my money, as it were. So for me, there's something really good about that. Secondly, I really enjoy having lots of different things I said to do, and that's in the sense of I enjoy learning new things and I enjoy finessing skills I've already got, and I enjoy making mistakes and owning up to it and learning and moving forward, hopefully with a bit of sort of humility as well. So for me, there's something there around how you engage with people, because that actually is a leadership tool in itself. The ability to hold your hand up and say sorry and front it and in front of people and call it out and be humble about it and move on, I think is a great leadership role modeling behaviour. I think it creates psychological safety for people that you are responsible for, or that you lead, or that you manage. And so for me, there's all sorts of wins really to transformation. I guess crucially though, now I think as well, it's something I'm quite good at, and I don't say that with any arrogance. There are many things I'm not good at, but I a few things that I'm quite good at as well. And I think that the ability to change things, to very quickly garner support, to get buy-in, to create energy, to keep momentum, to move at pace, to spin plates. I'm quite academic, so I understand a lot of conceptual things and lots of strategic stuff. I think all of those things really play into my wheelhouse, really. So I guess you could say, in a way, I found something that I'm quite happy with and quite good at, I suppose, really. The old maxim around, if you find something you enjoy, you'll never work a day in your life, I guess, would really.
Looking at all the transformations that you've led across housing, mental health, charities, local government, NHS, all those sectors are very different, but organisations that you've worked for have embraced that change. What is it that they have in common?
I guess really, ultimately, I suppose it's a bit like, I suppose if you were on a dating app, really, there's a person with a solution, if you will. And it's as simple as that. I think they've got a problem and I've got the answer. And there's an interest there. I think one of the things that I've found that's been a commonality of all of the organisations that I've worked in, and most of the ones I've been really happy in 99% of my working life, and there's been one or two sort of blips, as you know, but that's not unusual, is it, in 30 years of work? But I think one of the things that's been a commonality throughout all of them has been that there's been an acceptance that they want to change and they're ready for change. They are embracing of a diversity of thought around that change. And I think I've been quite lucky in a lot of ways that I've worked for a lot of people who've been very open-minded to that change. So if I can speak perhaps about some of the approaches that I've put forward are quite radical. I'm quite good at innovation in quite radical ways sometimes, because sometimes that's what's called for. You have to do something bold and different to make that change. And latterly as well, the kind of challenges that organisations face financially now, just to survive, that they require really bold action. Long gone are the days mini changes and trimming around the edges to survive. Those days are long gone. So I think that diversity of thinking and that openness to my ways and my ideas has been really beneficial to lots of organisations. And secondly, I think that diversity of thinking around personality and approach, so that actually, we don't necessarily want somebody who's going to produce reams and reams of strategies and prints to ratified documents. We actually want somebody who's going to engage the workforce, because actually we talk about change and transformation, but actually that doesn't exist. Change and transformation is an ethereal concept that can only be really attributed to a workforce. The workforce are the change, and they're also the ones that can inhibit or completely block that change. It's all about behaviours, values, culture, approach, style. That's what change is. Systems even don't work without a change of behaviour and culture. And I think that's where the thing I said about I'm quite good with people. I can generally connect quite quickly with people.
Yeah.
At pretty much most levels. I trade on the fact that I'm quite a plucky, cheery northerner. That's quite great for on the ground sometimes. Similarly, I can temper that a bit and kind of speak in more sort of political terms if I'm working with senior leaders or ministers or whatever in the past. And I think that's really the approach for anyone working in transformation, I suppose, really. It's that ability to flip hats all the time. You sometimes with the service user.
Very much so. And when you first walk into an organisation, what tells you within those first few weeks that, we are ready for change?
Or we are not ready for change.
Well, yeah.
I guess really it's their approach to me. So I know when I arrive and they're all briefed already, they're all smiling, they all know who I am, they're all welcoming, they're all up for it. You know, that immediate first contact, and that could be the same of any customer accessing a business actually as well, or, you know, a service. It's not exclusive to this particular context, but for the sake of the question, I think, you know, that kind of environment is the ripest one for change. And when you walk in somewhere and people don't know who you are, what you're doing, I've worked in organisations where people 2 months, 3 months in have never known who I am. You know, you feel like perhaps change is a losing battle in that place because the conditions around it aren't right. And that's not a slight against anyone or any organisation. It's just the timing perhaps isn't right if they're not embracing it fully. Because actually it's a moment in time. And there is a bit of a sweet spot with transformation, I think, where you're going to get the budget to do it, the timing and the opportunity, the landscape and the will. And those things come together, that little then in the middle sometimes. And it's quite a finely tuned time when that happens really in change circles. And if you don't hit it right and you don't pick it right and move with it and hold it right, it can all go incredibly wrong very fast. Lots of change programs don't work, obviously. I've worked on lots that have gone over budget, never on time. You know, lots of external factors and variables impact that, and again, more so now than ever, people's lives are incredibly challenging now for the most part. That's sort of customer lives, if you will, but indeed workforce as well. That impacts a lot of employees as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know very few people have experienced leadership from as many different perspectives as you have. You know, you've worked on the front line, you've led organisations, you've advised ministers, you've sat around board tables and influenced national policy. You know, what a great accolade of experience you've got there. When you look back across all of those environments, what surprises you most about the very best leaders? What have they got in common?
I think for me, one of the things that I've always tried to sort of take from good leaders, and one of the things that I think I'm quite good at now, is I think that the most important quality for a leader is to be kind. And what I mean by that is kind with your time, kind with your patience, kind with your knowledge, your experience, kind with your compassion and your understanding, you know, kind when you're getting the coffees in, you know, kindness full stop in every sense of the word. I think that is the most critical thing for a leader, I think, because if you're kind to people, you can generally get 90% of the work done. You know, if people support you, if there's psychological safety, if there's trust, it all stems from how you approach people and the culture you're setting, really, I suppose is what I'm saying in a roundabout sort of way. So with that in mind, the people that I've most admired and respected and had the best relationship with and had the most success with are people who've been like that. People who've been kind to me and kind of, you know, been that way. I think there are some of the soft skills and technical skills that sit around that. I mean, you couldn't necessarily be a good leader if you were just kind and nothing else, you know. But I think that as a cultural approach, as a personal style, I think that's the critical part of it. Having said that, I also respond very well to people who are very direct. You know, I'm a very straight talking northerner, you know, and again, I told you I trade on that a lot, and similarly I respond very well to that, but it's straight talking with kindness. You know, I don't want to be criticised, put down, humiliated. I have been in several roles by people in years gone by, and you know, that's not nice. Nobody comes to work for that. So I think it's that straight talking, not messing around, give it to me straight, but with kindness, and again, that contextual understanding of why a project may have gone awry or what's going on around it in the secondary sphere. But yeah, I think that the leaders really, I think as well, I think there's the people that surprise me most are the people who are quite unassuming and you see what they're about. I love that when you meet someone who's really unassuming and then they really, really surprise you with some or many skills or talents or achievements or things about them. I really enjoy that. I think that because that really replicates the life of our customers quite often as well, that they are presenting with one thing, but actually there's a whole circumstance in a life and a whole set of behaviours and experiences and joys and passions and loves and wishes that sit around that. And I think that really for me, you know, trying to replicate what we say we do with our customers, we should be doing that with our workforce as well, and indeed with each other. And I think that's sometimes the bit that's missing in a lot of organisations.
One of the things that came through strongly when we spoke was your belief in diversity of thinking. Can you just expand on that? What does diversity genuine look like from a leadership point of view to you?
Sure. So I think, again, there's two tracks here for me. So I think one of the things is around, you know, I suppose kind of thinking about it in a more EDI sort of space. But so does our workforce represent our customer base? So have we got people who have physical disabilities and, you know, are we encouraging all of them to come to work? Are we openly encouraging people who are trans to come and tell us about their experiences so we can apply that to the services that we offer? There's that diversity of thinking linked to EDI, but then there's something else for me around a diversity of thinking around valuing people's backgrounds and experiences and contributions. So, for example, you know, quite often in years gone by, people who, if you're a person who blurts out things in meetings and has a little bit of dysregulation around contribution, perhaps, I'm sure we've all been there. I know so if you're a person who operates like that, and I have in the past, the content of what you're saying could be missed by the way you're delivering it. And actually, sometimes there's real nuggets of gold in what people say. And, there's that thing about sort of overlooking people because of the way they present or what they're about isn't diversity of thought. That's exactly the kind of thing I think about, actually, not dismissing people just because of how they present, I guess is the underlying principle with this. Secondly, I suppose it's about getting to the bottom of what people are actually saying and what they're bringing to the party. Everybody has something valuable to contribute in my eyes. And quite often, again, to my latter point I made about people surprising you sometimes, it's often those people who've got the most valuable contribution in my experience. And obviously then the whole thing around lived experience and customer, I think it's really crucial that voices like that are not alone, that actually people who can speak for customer, who have been a customer or have experienced those things or have a really detailed understanding through years of experience of working with, I think they're the most critical voice within this story. But again, sometimes that gets a bit lost, and particularly now if you think about sort of mental health workers, social workers who are doing jobs that are almost impossible, or police officers, when do they get a chance to offer up that learning and that experience, because they're so overrun and overworked dealing with the day-to-day and the BAU stuff. They're the voices in terms of diversity of thinking. I think it's critical for me, really, and actually critical for any organisation to be successful now.
Yeah, very much so. So alongside everything else, you've advised the Ministry of Defence on supporting veterans returning from active service. Has working at national policy level changed the way that you think about leadership?
Yes, it has. Yes, I hope I don't get done for treason or breaching the official by discussing this. So I've got time to discuss this. So yeah, I suppose really what it's shown me is that on a local level, everything's done with great intention and all the building blocks are sound. And on a national level, all the building blocks are there and the thinking is sound. And I think this may seem blatantly obvious to say this, so apologies if people are rolling their eyes, but I feel like really, and I speak this from experience, what's missing is the connection in the middle. Right. So that I don't know what that I couldn't necessarily say what that gap is, because it'll be different for different regions and areas, because obviously people have different needs in different parts of the country, and devolution is clearly an agenda that speaks to that currently more so than ever. But I think there's definitely a miss. I think one of the things that I found, and again, I hope it's okay to say this, but I think one of the things I found very stark about doing that work on my public appointments and the other stuff I've done with central government has been around how very different those people look to me. So many of those people, brilliant people, nothing bad to say about any of these people, but a lot of people are traditionally quite white, I think quite wealthy, quite often quite middle or upper class, had a very different education and upbringing to me. And that's great. But I think in that sense, sometimes I felt a bit like a lone voice. I didn't look or have the experience of those people. Again, not a criticism at all. And not all of central government is like that. I am not for one moment saying that. This is not a negative discussion. It's an observation from doing that work. And I think perhaps that's the challenge, that how do we get those people, those young Muslim women, or in Scotland, or those young trans people in Sunderland, how do we get them represented in that setting in a true way, if they aren't already? It might be that they are, but my experience wasn't that. So I think that's the real dichotomy in the middle there, around how does that national policy reflect the local agenda, and how does it enable it? Because clearly if somebody is making decisions or policy in central government in London, I'm not sure how valid people in Halifax would feel that is for them, as an example. I don't know. It's an observation. I'm not offering it up as cast iron truth. It's simply an observation.
So what do you think the way forward is on that then?
Well, I mean, I think that, what we're seeing now with loads more combined authorities, devolution, obviously Andy Burnham has got huge plans around this. I mean, interestingly, number 10 North, whether it will work or not as an actual operation, I think just the message behind it is so incredibly powerful that, we're trying to reduce this gap here, this inequality gap, this whole gap around everything being London-centric. I'm from Yorkshire originally, but I lived in London for 25 years. I'm very recently relocated to the Midlands, where I've lived for 6 weeks. So I spent all and everything is very geared towards London. So I think the notion of taking that away is not taking it away, but making it more balanced is a great starting point from that, because it starts at the top. Now, clearly, it needs to be followed through with lots more devolutionary type activity. And I hate to use the phrase levelling up, because I'm not sure what it means anymore after several. and ministers and leaders. But I think that the notion of levelling up in its truest sense is something that we need to keep on with. And, that's going to cost money. And, that's the way it is, because you can't do it without investing in it. But I think there is some real interesting change coming, like the sort of designated local authority boundaries, for example, is going to be an interesting one to watch going forward. And interesting for me because I've worked in so many local authorities in my career as an interim. I think I've worked in 16 local authorities altogether, so a lot of them in London, so albeit that those boundaries aren't changing. But I think it'll be interesting to see what that looks like going forward, and then if there's any meat on the bones and the teeth behind it, really, that's going to be the critical part. But for me, I think it's exciting. It's the first time I felt excited about political change in a long time, that actually, whatever your political colour, whatever your views, I think it's fair to say that Andy Burnham looks like he's going to shake it up. And whether that be for the good or the bad, time will tell. But change can't be bad, because let's face it, it's not working that well at the minute. Yeah. So for me, 100%. I think it starts, really. Don't hold me to it, though.
Watch this space, I think. So despite all that strategic work that you've done over your career, you still volunteer with Shelter. Why staying connected to the frontline services remains so important to you?
I guess for me, I've never really forgotten where I started, and I think for leaders, it's really important to have that connection to your service user. I don't work for Shelter, so I'm a volunteer for them, but I'm not, as I'm not connected to the leadership of that organisation. But I think it's really important to remember where you came from and what you're about. And similarly, in leadership roles, it's important to know your customers and what's going on the ground. I also really enjoy it because, obviously, being in quite senior roles, dealing with a lot of very serious issues a lot of the time, lots of challenges around safeguarding and budgets and stuff like that, and reputational crises. It's actually quite nice to go and do something that is the joy of making somebody smile because you're helping them, rather than doing a challenge. And I love my job, but it's nice to do something different. And it's where I started as well. And there's a real part of me that always feels like quite, if I was an emotional person, I have emotion, but I'm not particularly emotional. But if I had emotion, I'd probably cry quite a lot, because there's like really full circle. In a way, I suppose I'm quite proud as well that I managed to turn this around, and I managed to make it a good thing for me. I mean, there were many times during that period when I was homeless and all the stuff that followed afterwards and all the traumatic things that happened to me. There were many times when it could have gone a different way, and maybe I wouldn't even be here now, and I'm always cognizant of that fact, really, that for some people life it's on a knife's edge, isn't it, at times like that. And I think it's important, it's my guiding principle, really, to remember and not to forget that just because my life's in a pretty good place right now, it might not be forever. Things can go wrong on the drop of a hat. But secondly, people are what matter. I take my responsibilities as a citizen really seriously. The social contract, I think we all have a duty to help each other, because really without each other we are nothing. And again, I know that sounds really trite and people might be rolling their eyes, but it's true. I think it's really important we help each other in whatever way we can. Even if it's just smiling at someone in the street, it can make a difference.
Very much so. If I spoke to people who have worked with you over the years, what would you hope they would say made you different as a leader?
What do I hope, or what do I know? I'm in touch with who I've worked for. Like the majority of my friends are people I've worked with or I've managed or have managed me over the years. I would say 90% of my friendship group is that. I think that they would say my style and my approach. And I know that one thing that people say about me is unwavering support. I've never sold anyone out. I've never chucked anyone under a bus. I've never let anyone down. I would fight for the hill, and I would deal with things in private if people had done things wrong. But I'm really loyal to people who work for me. Who I manage and who I lead. I take that very seriously, and that support thing as well. And I know people say that's quite unusual. I think we talk a lot about blame-free and stuff like that, and I really subscribe to that. Because I know I've made mistakes in the past and I've been dragged over the coals for it, and it didn't really serve any purpose, to be honest, because it didn't change the past and it just made everyone feel worse. So I think with that in mind, I've always tried to really subscribe to that, and it's hard. It takes a lot of energy to always be 100% calm and emotion free, and it's quite exhausting in many ways, to kind of always be person centered in terms of leadership. But that's what the job's about. That's what you're getting paid for, and that's the expectation. Therefore, you do it. Is my approach. And I think the humour as well. I've got a cracking sense of humour. I know that.
If you could change one thing about the charity sector tomorrow, what would it be?
That's an interesting one. I might need a minute to think on that. I guess I think that. The role of a charity CEO, I think, now is so different to what it was even 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago when I started out in this world of work in this sector. And in some senses, charity CEOs now are like influencers, aren't they? They're so tied up so often, or need to be, because optics are everything in the world we live in now. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think it's just a truth. And with that in mind, I know that so many CEOs of charities and leaders who are of an age perhaps where they're not comfortable or even understanding or au fait with TikTok, Instagram, socials, etc. And I think that's a real challenge, because actually to have that profile is clearly of a benefit to the organisation. I do work with one CEO who's really resistant. He's a brilliant man. He's great at his job, but he's so resistant to posting all the time online. And I kind of get that. I understand why he don't want to do it. But I think that he's probably missing a bit of the trick, because some of his peers are out there securing a lot more funds and a lot more income and a lot more reputational bonus because of that stuff. And I see both sides. But I think that for me is a real challenge there around, how do we secure and safeguard organisations for the next 20 years? Perhaps when that generation have retired, which will be in the next 20 years, things might be a bit different. Although I don't know what the face of social media and digital will look like in 20 years. I mean, it'll be way more advanced than what it is now. I mean, heaven knows. I'll probably people I've just mentioned who's got no understanding of it whatsoever, and he's completely resistant to it. So there you go, you heard it here. Out in the future. But yeah, I think that's a big challenge about. So what I'm talking about there is pivoting, sort of profiling, presence, all that stuff. Really, I think it's a real challenge for charities and how they find the time to do it with got such limited resources. Obviously, sort of funding is the other big issue, and I think that there has to be different ways of doing things. That's absolutely got to be acknowledged. And there are a lot of organisations that, are stuck in a bit of a situation, and I say this from experience, where they really need to change to survive, but they don't have the resource or the ability or the capability or the workforce to change. And they're stuck in this awful phase in the middle where they're just kind of get stagnated and get left behind, really, because they can't invest because they haven't got the money, but they don't have the workforce to drive the change because they're so small. And I think that's a real shame, because those local grassroots organisations have got such an important part to play in community life and in resolution of issues, but also in terms of informing the bigger players as well. And again, that's a problem that I'm not sure how you square that circle, really, but there has to be something around infrastructure that values those and allows those organisations to just be, or for a different way to exist, I guess, really.
It's really interesting, the point that you made there about the sort of social media side of things. I was taking a job spec from a trustee, a chair of the board of trustees for a charity the other day, and she was saying that the environment outside of the charity was so fast paced and so fast moving, dynamic, and they as an organisation hadn't quite got to grips with the wider world, and they were sort of left in this place of not knowing what the future held. And I think that's something that a lot of charity CEOs, as you said, do need to get an understanding of and get to grips with what that looks like moving forward. And everything's changing so quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, and their purpose within that, because, so many organisations now, again, that I've worked with and gone into, is that they're, if you think about business development, which obviously I'm involved a lot in transformation terms, that quite often they're bidding and tendering and contracting for money and services that are so far away from what they do as bread and butter and so far away from their mission. They're barely hanging on to what they've got simply to survive. And actually, I totally understand the need to do that. And if it's for the greater good and it gets you from A to Z, fair enough. But again, there's a real loss of mission drift, I guess you might call it, really. And, challenge as well, because you have to ask yourself, if you're not doing what you set out to do, what's the point? I mean, what's the point in chasing all that money to do something completely different? You might as well be something different. But again, some organisations are rooted in communities where they were set up for a specific purpose, and that history and purpose and sort of experience shouldn't ever be lost, really. And I'm certainly the organisation that I'm a trustee of. I'm a board member of two, but I'm a trustee. I've been there for about 8 years now, I think. And, that's a very small community-based organisation. It's the thing I love about it, and it's why I've stayed there so long, because it's rooted still in exactly what it was set up for, and it's brilliant. It just does all the same small stuff that it did when it started, but with huge impact. It's just a traditional small community organisation that doesn't want to be £20 million. They're not interested. They don't want that. They exist for. We've been very survived as long as we have, admittedly, and there have been many a rocky day in the past 8 years. But I guess really it's bringing all that stuff together and taking the richness from it.
Definitely. So finally, I know many of our listeners will either be leading their first teams or perhaps thinking about stepping into their first CEO role. What piece of advice would you give to them?
Oh, God, what do I know? Crikey. Without being trite, be yourself. I mean, like I said, you'll have loads of stuff in your armour, in your toolbox as a person. Your life experiences, whatever they are, will inform a lot of what you're doing. Be kind, be a laugh, be fun. You can bring everyone on your journey when you have a laugh. Honestly, it's a great tool. Don't cracking a joke. Make the brews, and don't ever forget why you're there. I think for me, they're the important things. So not one thing they're strategic at all. I don't know what.
I think those are all great advice, aren't they, for life in general, actually. You've got to enjoy what you're doing, haven't you? And life becomes fun when you're enjoying it. So thank you so much for joining me today, Brian. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on. And I think what comes through really clearly is that leadership isn't about titles or positions. It's about that authenticity, isn't it? And that compassion, which pretty much sums up what you've said there. So thanks for sharing your story so openly with us. And thank you, obviously, to all our listeners. If you've enjoyed the episode of Charity Champions, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review or share with someone that you think could enjoy the conversation. Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you.